Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer of dark fantasy that has created a world that is as elaborate as her plots. She's joining me today to discuss the first book of the Mose Chronicles, entitled Rise of a Dark Throne. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Ligia Cushman. Ligia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 11th day of April 2024. I came across your work and met you by joining your Instagram live stream one night where you were editing what I believe was the third book of the Mose Chronicles. My interest was piqued after you explained the elements of your genre and work, so I checked out the first book in your series, Rise of a Dark Throne. What I found was a highly immersive world filled with supernatural intrigue, romance, and betrayal, which I thoroughly enjoyed, so I'm excited to have you on the show to talk about this impressive work of dark fantasy.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been really fun to write it, sure.
Well, so the book is about a young woman named Sol, who is the princess of an empire called Mose. She is rapidly thrust into the role of queen when her parents, a large portion of her kingdom's governing body, and her husband are killed by a mysterious plague called the Darkness on what was technically the night of her honeymoon. And the concept of actual magic, spelt with a CK, is a very real prospect in Sol's bloodline, and she discovers that she possesses a very powerful form of it. So when she realizes this, she asks the Holy Mother, which I think is kind of the one true God, I guess, in the story, for the ability to revive her dead husband Nasir from the dead. Mm-hmm. And once the requirements for this power are revealed, she sets out on a journey to obtain the strength needed to do exactly that. Sol's parents were sent away from Sundom by her grandparents, who then traveled to the land of Mose within the broader region of Transea. So could you provide a rundown of the geography of this world that you've created?
Sure. I have this very beautiful map, and for those who can't see it, I'll explain kind of the makeup of it. But in Mose or in Transea, what's really unique about this world is that it has two suns, two moons. Those of you who are old fogies like me who grew up watching Star Wars, I mean, Tatooine, right? You fall in love with these spaces far, far away with these two orbs in the sky. So I knew when I started writing the series that I would want it to have those feels of what fascinated me as a child watching sci-fi and dark fantasy movies and shows. So 2 suns, 2 moons. We have about 5, what we would consider continents in our world, but this is not based in our Earth. It's a whole different realm, a whole different planet. Half of the world is desert. So you think of like the Middle East and those spaces where there's more sand than there is water. And so that is where Sundom, this whole realm here of Sundom, comes through. And then all these other patches of pieces are what I consider the Western Isles, which is made up of the Sanctum, the Vantine Woods, Mosa, and Grimmergris. So when I was thinking about building this world, I sat with my son, who is a budding scientist, and I said to him, hey, I want a world with 2 suns, 2 moons. Tell me about how this world would work. He's like, oh my gosh, you're going to have really high tides. You're going to have low tides. There may be seasons where the water is really high, which can cause catastrophes that take place.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all still in the back of my mind for book 3, book 4, as I'm writing this adventure and really trying to map it out. So that's a big part of the geography in the world. I think it's important too. Sundom, although it's not rich in water, it is rich in everything else. They have all the gold. They have built their riches by building armor and beautiful blades. And so you'll hear throughout my stories about people talking about it's almost as good as a Sundonian blade because they're the masters of war. And then for Mosa and the other islands, it's a little different. They're more peaceful. They have access to water. So when you think of economical power in this world, it's those who hold the blades, but also those who hold the water. And so that's where some of this strife has come from between Sundom and everybody else. But Sundom also runs all of Transea. So in each continent, if you will, you have leaders, right? Kings and queens, but then you have the high kings and queens of Sundom who oversee everybody else. And so it's a big political world full of chaos and betrayal and love, and it's fun. It's a fun place. I don't know that I want to live there, but it's pretty fun.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was supposed to be part of the existing world that just existed in the past, kind of like the lost city of Atlantis or something like that. But it sounds like it was your son, you said?
Yeah. My son, Jaden. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It sounds like your son created this from the ground up. I mean, he's even formulated the way that the tides would react to having, I guess, the gravitational pull of 2 suns, was it? You know?
Correct.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yes. As I talk more about the series, you'll hear how it's a family affair at this house for sure. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was going to say something else about Sundom in that the people there are very much drawn by the old traditions, the old way of doing things. So I divided the world up into 2 sides because of my parents and where they come from. They come from the Dominican Republic. And so on their island, they share that island with Haiti. And there's been a lot of strife over the years between both nations, kind of battling it out, whether they like each other, they don't. And so I wanted to paint that picture of lines are really drawn in the sand, if you will, but there's a lot of conflict because of the historical decisions made by both sides, the Eastern Isles and the Western Isles.
Okay. Well, one of the very interesting, very wonder-inciting elements in your story and the land in general is the very compelling aspect of bioluminescence in the story, particularly a bioluminescent sea.
Yeah.
And one of the most enthralling passages in the book that describes this aspect is on page 81, and it states, "Without the light of the lantern, they could see the millions of stars populating the night sky and below. The bioluminescent ocean glowed bright. If one squinted, one could hardly tell where the sky began and the sea ended." So what was the background and significance of this element for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always tell people that this story is centered on women of color, but it's inspired by the Caribbean. And so there are 2 islands. I love many islands in the Caribbean, let me be clear, but the Dominican Republic is definitely one of them. And Puerto Rico is another. And Puerto Rico is known for having a bioluminescent bay. Once I saw it, I knew I needed this to be part of the story. So the way I do world building is, of course, consulting with the scientific expert in my home, my son, but then also traveling to places. So we traveled to Puerto Rico. We got to see what the sea looks like, the bioluminescence. I went kayaking at night with glow-in-the-dark canoes, like trying to feel like, what can Mosa actually feel like? And for me, it was important to have this aspect One, because growing up, I didn't even know that bioluminescent bays existed, let alone in the Caribbean. The unique thing about the one in Puerto Rico is you can't swim in it. It's toxic. It's not healthy. Like, it can cause some serious damage. So I wanted a bioluminescent bay in Mosa that really was the gathering place. So on the center of the island where people went to get married, where people went to celebrate events, I wanted that experience for the reader. And then, of course, Avatar. Who doesn't love Avatar? All the bioluminescent plants. And I just thought this is a perfect combination of two things that I love dearly. So yeah, I'm really proud of that aspect of the world building that I've been able to do.
Well, you made me feel better when you said the bioluminescent bay in Puerto Rico is toxic, because I was literally just there on my honeymoon. And I was like, oh my God, what did I miss out on? But I was like, okay, I guess I didn't miss out on anything.
You can't swim in it. I mean, people jump in it, but you definitely don't want to do that.
That's interesting. Huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Whereabouts? We were in San Juan. Is it?
It's towards the countryside. So, Puerto Rico's really small as an island. You can drive the whole island in a day, but it's near the countryside. So.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, there is a custom, so to speak, within the kingdom of Sundom. The second-born children are considered inferior to the firstborn and are often shunned in a sense. Yeah. So what, along with this concept, prompted Sol's grandparents to send the family away from the land of Sundom initially?
Ooh, I got to figure out how I'm going to answer this without giving away other parts of the story.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Tread lightly.
So I'm going to tread very lightly. So originally, my vision of this world, Transea, right, is that everyone lived in Sundom at some point. No one had ventured off into the Western Isles, which is what they called them originally. It was no one lived there. There wasn't a lot, but there was a lot of strife happening between the leaders of houses, House of Port, House of Doramos. There was a lot of strife in these multiple rich, big families that all literally answered to the High King. Evil, not a really great guy, evil to his children. I wrote the prequel recently to Rise of a Dark Throne, which is available for free on my website. So I feel like I can share some of those pieces because those historical pieces are in there, in that there was a lot of problems between the High King of Sundom and how he interacted with his people. He was raping women, causing harm, taking land. And so there was a civil war brewing. So at the beginning of Rise of a Dark Throne, you see a young King Axel and they're having him flee to Mosa with whatever relatives he has left. And he eventually becomes Sol's father. But they were trying to overthrow the throne. And so in that heat of that night, they tried to escape or get rid of or send away as many relatives as they could to safety. And that's how they found the island of Mosa. And that's where Axel built a new world. I talk about 4 generations later because in Mosa, 4 generations isn't like 4 generations here or in Transea. And so he meets Ligia and they build this really beautiful like oasis of a world. And in Rise of a Dark Throne, you get a quick glimpse because sooner than later, Sol is on a ship and she's on her way sailing away from that beautiful oasis of a life that she's had. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Oh, yeah. 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 If I ask anything that leaves you in fear of inducing a spoiler, feel free to pass
for
on
sure,
that.
For sure.
Well, as the newly appointed Queen of Mosa, part of Sol's diplomatic duties is to help neighboring lands, even if it happens to be the land her family fled.
Yeah.
So therefore, she agrees to be picked up by a boat and taken to the land of Sundom to heal the King of Sundom with her magic. And I guess boat isn't exactly a good term for it. It was a large, massive ship.
Yeah.
So the ship is under the charge of Prince Rivian, the second-born son of, let me see if I can get it, King Adien Alacour II?
Yes.
Close enough? So Rivian was born into the privilege of being a prince, but with the disadvantage of being the second-born. Mm-hmm. How does this dichotomy primarily affect his character?
Oh, it impacts every second-born in this story. So I am the second-born of 6. And so for me, I wanted to tell the story of like this middle child that sometimes doesn't get their say because they've got the oldest that speaks out for everyone, and then they've got the baby. And so every second born, third born, there's not many children that are born for whatever reason in Transea. Every second and third born child are sent to a place called the sanctum, where they go to be, one, separated from their sibling, who is the heir of the throne, and two, to really be programmed that their role is never to overthrow their kingdom. Their role is to align with the throne, protect the throne at all costs. And so you see that kind of play out for Rivian in this story where he adores his brother. He knows his brother is next in line. He was taken away from his family. So every child that goes to the sanctum, they leave their family at around age 5 to 7. And they go to the sanctum, which is a horrible place. Mm-hmm. Think of like a boarding school that's abusive. And it's almost like every second-born child's rite of passage. Sundom is also a little bit more harsh in how they treat their second-born children. So they will tattoo their face to identify them as this is a second-born. Even if they don't even look like their sibling, they're still getting their faces tattooed, which was a total opposite. And this happens like as young children, which is the total opposite of what the king of Mosa decided for his own daughters. At one point, he decides, okay, I'm going to send Sol to the sanctum. She didn't last a month there before he went and got her. And so that was unheard of, that a king would go and get their child out of the sanctum before the high priest of the sanctum said that they were ready to return home. So that also created some strife between the king of Mosa and the sanctum. And so you have all these political pieces, falling into the story. And I think for me, I wanted to show some sort of like brutality in how the sanctum treats their children and their people. And so in the prequel that I just wrote, in that story, there are some answers about how harsh are they really? What do they really do? How do they tattoo people's faces? Do they get their consent? Do they not? And so those pieces you can find in the prequel, but I really wanted to build a world that was really a space in Sundom that was really violent. And oh my gosh, if my mom were hearing this, that was really violent and abusive. I wanted to point out, like, this is what happens when leaders who don't really care about their subjects, what happens if you let someone like that take over for generations. So Rivian is impacted differently, I think, because he loves his brother. His brother loves him. And he believes that by his brother's side, he can protect Sundom. They can lead Transea together. And so it's a beautiful relationship that becomes strained over time.
And you characterized it as a boarding school. The sanctum I'm talking about, is it also kind of like a military school? Were they trained to fight?
Yes, they were trained to fight. And just to give a little bit about the premise, Sol wakes up with magic after having experienced this plague. And magic had not been around for 4 generations. And so that was one of the issues with the people of Sundom, was people with magic were a threat to them. And so they wanted to figure out how to get rid of them. I say all that because it's important in the story in that when Rivian arrives to Mosa, he's been sent on this wild goose chase. There were apparently like 3 or 4 women in the Western Isles that had been found to have magic. And every time he showed up on an island, no magic. So here he gets to this island and here's Sol, and she's beautiful and she's smart and witty and she has magic and she's his enemy. And so you see it in the first act of the story. There's a lot of like strife between the 2 kingdoms. I mean, even the way they talk about the women of Mosa before they even meet Sol is problematic, but it's showing the generations of this conflict between the East and the West.
Gotcha. Well, by her side, Sol has her most trusted advisor, Nisa, who is also the brother of her recently deceased husband. And Nisa is a combination of comedy and, for lack of a better word, badassery.
Yes.
And
yes. I love that. Yes.
And in the acknowledgments, you mentioned that Nisa is based on your best friend, Melissa. Can you tell us about Melissa and her similarities to Nisa?
Yes, I will try to do that without crying.
Oh, okay.
So No, it's okay. It's okay. So Melissa was very much like Nisa. She was a badass. She also came from Puerto Rico. Another reason why I felt like I wanted to have Puerto Rico in this story. And, Melissa had a lot of wit. She never met a stranger. She called things like she saw them. And I hope that that's what people found in Nisa, that she was loyal to a T. And then on top of all of that was beautiful. She could walk into a room and all eyes were on her. And I wanted to show that difference between Soul and Nisa and still be able to really showcase how they were so close that even in Nasir's death, there was no blaming of the other. Not that they would, but there was no conflict between them other than we are all each other has now, and we have to protect that. So yeah, Nisa is Melissa, Melissa is Nisa. There's no changing it. And I wrote Nisa into the story and the way that I wrote her story. So I won't share how the book ends or anything, but the way that I wrote her story was very much like some of the things that I experienced with Melissa. And so, yeah, I can tell you that on TikTok, there's a scene with Nisa at the end where people get really frustrated. And so people have made videos recording themselves throwing my book across the room when, things go a different way than they had anticipated. And so it's been really fun for people to fall in love with Melissa/Nisa in a whole new way.
Yeah, I had not seen the character representations until after reading the book. Mm-hmm. So I had an idea of what Nisa looked like and what Soul looked like, but it was interesting to see them portrayed in those pictures because you've got Soul, who is just fairy tale beautiful, and then you've got Nisa, who is as well, but she's got this edge to her, like she will cut you.
She will cut you and not think twice. She tells Soul exactly how she feels. She's like, that guy likes you. Stay away from him. Like, he's cute, but don't pay attention. Like, she's a true best friend. Even when she is not in the room, when Soul is not in the room and Nisa is, and she hears the Sandonian talking crap about Soul, she will call them out every single time. So there's a scene where Zari is saying something about Soul or Nisa, and all his crewmen are like staring at him like, he's like, is she behind me? They're like, yeah, she is behind you. So it becomes this funny little play on, oh, here comes Nisa again. She's not like the others. But yeah, I love her character so much. She's one of my favorites.
Well, Soul is also protected by the Misa warriors. They kind of serve as her secret service, and they keep their faces hidden behind masks so that only Soul knows their true appearances, demonstrating their complete devotion to the Queen. Mm-hmm. And just as the Secret Service and Navy SEALs undergo specialized training enveloped in mystique, what is the background behind the training of the Misa warriors?
Oh, I love this question. I love this question so much. So when I was researching, I did a lot of research for this book, and it's part of my educational background anyway, as a therapist, counselor. Like, I love research. I love data. I like to know stories. And so I was really digging into Africa and what were warriors like back then, and were there elite soldiers, and what were they called, and how did they fight, and how did they train? And this was before the movie The Woman King came out. So when the Woman King movie came out, I was like, oh my gosh, these are the Dahomies that I was talking about that I put in my book. So the Misa warriors are really based on the Dahomey warriors in Africa, from Western Africa. And I was thrilled to be able to create them, thrilled to learn that they were one of the most feared regiments in all of history. And they were women, right? They did not have guns. They had swords. And I even got access to some old journals of British soldiers that sailed to Africa that got to meet these warrior women, and they were terrified of them. And so I wanted to learn, like, how did they train? What did they do? And so I love letters for that reason, because you can go back through time and really learn. And then, of course, I added my own flair to it. I thought having the mask would be brilliant because you can't tell who they are. You shouldn't know who they are. And much like those who went to the sanctum, the Misa warriors also went to training on the island of Mosa. I don't talk about that a lot in book 1, but in book 2, we're reintroduced to the Misa warriors in a whole new way. And so I'm excited for Magic Rising, because I think there were a lot of readers after reading book 1 that were like, please bring back the Misa warriors, please. I honestly had no intentions of doing that until I got feedback from other readers that were like, we need them, so please bring them back. But I think their training was really difficult. They raced on horseback, bareback. I think of Wonder Woman and the Amazons. They're very much like that. They shoot bows and arrows. They have beautiful swords. And their focus solely is protecting the royal house of Mosa. And so in the first book, you'll hear about how the darkness just took them out. Soldiers couldn't, but the darkness could. And so there's those moments where Soul is told, I think she's told there's only 15 Misa warriors left out of like 800. So it's a dark time, but also a hopeful time because she still has some people to protect her who will not betray her. And Nisa is very much like that, even though she was not a Misa warrior.
Well, on the opposite side of the spectrum, much like Soul, Prince Rivian had his own entourage, Kia, Luce, and Zari. Zari was Rivian's best friend and the head of the Sun Guard Army, and Kia was second in command of the Sun Guard Army, and Luce was the chief warrant officer of the Sun Guard Army. So what did each of these characters bring to the table when it came to being Rivian's advisors?
I love these people so much. When I was character building, I had to create the characters before I could write the story. I needed to know who they were. Every single character that you've mentioned so far has a full backstory. But this crew are a brilliant crew. I love the banter between them. You can tell that although they're not related, they are family. That's their chosen family. They were all at the sanctum together. And I think that that bonded them. Rivian at one point dated Kia. And I think that that also bonded them so that he still cares for her, not in the same way that she does for him, but she will never let that get in the way of protecting him and telling him how she feels about things. So I think their relationship is hilarious. I think it's also sad in that they've had to create this family because Rivian, when he was sent back from the sanctum, his father sent him on that ship that you were talking about, the Radiant. He put them on the Radiant and sail the seas until I tell you to come back. And so his mates, his friends came with him. They were like, wherever you go, we go. And so even though they didn't want to go to Mosa, because why? Who wants to go to Mosa? They went with him anyway. And so I think that shows from the very beginning how much they love him, but they also really respect him. And so if he told them to settle down, they settled down. You know, they'd get drunk together, of course, but there is a love there. And you would think Kia is like the soft one, but I think it's Zari in a lot of ways. It's not Kia. Zari's really emotional and he like falls really hard for people and he speaks what's on his mind. Luce is the comedian. I don't think a lot of people take him seriously in book one. In book two, there's a lot of losses that happen and he will be a bit different. They all will. And so I'm excited for people to see how he shows up now. And Zari too. They're different.
Yeah, Luce, I don't know if you were channeling these vibes or not, but I got like a Lord Byron rake
100%
vibe coming from Luce. Yeah.
100%. 100%.
And Kia was an elf. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the Sundonians have like pointy ears, but it's not like, oh, we have all this magic. It's not like that. It's just how they look, but it's not embedded in anything other than that. But yeah, I think of her like Tinkerbell. Like she looks like that. She has a short pink bob and, you know, all of that, but she's got a potty mouth and she will cut you without thinking twice.
But isn't being an elf itself, like when I say elf, people automatically think of something cute or whatever, but isn't it the result of something bad? I'm stretching my brain trying to remember where elves come from.
Yeah, so it came from, in my theory, it's the lack of water that they experienced. So when the kingdoms divided, we had one side that was rich in resources, natural resources, including the water, and then you had one side that wasn't. And so they're elves. And so when we think about elves, like we think of the pointy ears, we don't think of them as tanned and all that, but they've got darker skin, bright eyes. So I wanted to pull in kind of like a Dune vibe to the people of Mosa. And so, yeah, she definitely is like that. A little twist is that Zari is actually a descendant of the people of Mosa. And so in the book, you'll hear Nisa say to him things like, oh, you must be so comfortable with our enemy, right? She'll say, how can you love people who did this to our people? And so there's that struggle that happens. Like, these are the people that I love, even though the king is evil to my parents, but I love Rivian and I love Kia and I love Luce. And we're going to see a different side of Luce in book 2. So I'm excited for people to see how they're growing too.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, romantic feelings and resulting jealousy manifested among the group, punctuated by the fact that despite initially viewing the men as mindless animals, the women still found themselves falling victim to romantic stirrings based on physical attraction.
Yes.
So how were you attempting to portray the struggle between intellect and instinct? Because as hardcore as Nisa was, I forget who it was she would fawn over. Was it Luce that would just drive her nuts?
Zari.
Or it was Zari, yeah.
Yeah.
Zari would just behave in a way that she found reprehensible, but then every once in a while she'd look at him and be like, oh, God.
Right? But isn't that life? Isn't that life? Like, I feel like in my stories, I wanted to portray like an honest perception of like how real life is. Yes, the guy is a hottie and I'm smart and I can read books too. Like, I wanted to feel the struggle. I wanted people to read and see, oh, Nisa's having the struggle. Soul is having the struggle, right? Soul is a bookworm. Like, she could tell you all the history of Mosa and all the history of Sundom and all of those things. But when she sees Rivian, as annoyed as he makes her, she also can see the qualities, right? He's beautiful, he's smart, and he's annoying. And so I like that part of the story because I feel like opposites attract. And I wanted to really show that that's also okay. And that intellect and instinct, they really coexist, right? Especially in my stories, they really coexist, that you can still be drawn to a person and not agree with everything. I mean, there's these moments where Soul and Rivian at night are just speaking about their lives to each other on deck, right? And he's sharing his pain and she's coming back and saying, you should be thankful for X, Y, and Z. And then he'll be like, well, how you want to save this world, but you're not even a part of it. And so there's still this depth to those relationships that I dug deep with Rivian and with Soul. But Zari and other stories, because I was about to give away something, Zari and other stories are going to unfold in the other books that I think will be really interesting.
Okay. Well, Rivian begins to develop strong feelings for Soul that are best described on page 119. Quote, Zari, forgive me. I forgot myself. Something has changed. I have changed, and I don't know what to do. All I know is that our attraction is a well-balanced kind of madness, and I do not regret it. End quote.
Yeah.
So, can you expand on Rivian's statement? Is that more of the instinct versus intellect, or a little bit more complex than that?
I think it's a little bit more complex because, remember, this is his enemy, too.
Mm-hmm.
And so generations of hate, generations of, creating this story about the women of Mosa, right? So they're flighty and they're free and, they're not smart. And at one point, I think Luce, when they arrive, says, oh, I may have removed this chapter, but Luce is like, oh yeah, I heard they're ugly and like all those kinds of things. And then they get there and they're like, oh my God, not only is this world and this beach beautiful, but wow, look at these people. And I think that they started to see, oh, wait, these people are different. So at one point, there are definitely feelings, and Rivian falls first. I thought that would be important because I wanted to show the struggle that he would have. Soul was not going to admit much at this point. I mean, she fell asleep, woke up, her husband experienced the darkness, and then all of a sudden, here's this guy who's the total opposite of what she fell in love with and what she was going to marry and the life she was going to have. And so I think it took her more time. It took her a little bit more time than it took him. But I love that line that it's a well-balanced kind of madness that you don't regret, because that's kind of like what falling in love feels like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to make sure that that statement, that he was the one who said that before she did. And so I think in this scene, he's like really explaining to Zari, like, dude, I'm like messed up right now. I need help and I don't know how to get out of this.
Well, getting back to the world building, a really interesting element was the dark wilds. Before the ship arrives in Sundom, part of their mission is to make a stop in a wild, untamed land called the Dark Wilds. And this encompasses a system of caves within a forest right before the Sundom border. So could you talk about your inspiration for the topography, vegetation, and overall environment of the Dark Wilds? Because when they get there, it's not this simple, but it's almost like it's raw sewage.
It is. And so the Dark Wilds for me, it was strange because a big chunk of the story is at sea, right? And a lot of things are happening. And then you hit Act 2 and it's like, oh, wait, now we're in a different place. But I think I wanted to put a space in between getting to Sundom versus being at sea, being in the Sirena Sea, and having just a moment where Rivian and Sol have to do something together. But I wanted it to feel creepy and I wanted it to feel like this unknown place. And so even on the map, it's like this dark space right here. So I wanted it to have jagged cliffs that the ocean waves are like crashing into it. And I wanted it to be a cave system because what I can say that's just like a little sneak is that Rivian and Sol did not go deep enough. There's more in there. And so I wanted it to just be like a peeling back of this one layer of an onion. So I wanted people to go to the Dark Wilds originally, like in book 1, and then we're going to talk about it again in book 3. And so I wanted that world because I'm still dabbling with some ideas about where does magic come from? Does it land in this place? Is it in this space? Does it matter? Do I need to explain where magic comes from? I don't know yet. So that's a part of my story that I'm still trying to unpack. I don't know that I'll ever explain it, but I do think if I were to explain it, the Dark Wilds was going to have something to do with it for sure.
Gotcha. And not to go off into the weeds, but I feel like I've seen fantasy novels that utilize the IC spelling of magic. What is your delineation between IC and ICK, and what kind of made you decide to apply it to their form of magic?
I like different spellings. I'll just be honest of words that we use typically. I love different spellings on things like that. But I also feel like, for me, I read a lot of dark fantasy from British novels and from British authors and from, American authors. In British novel and folklore, they spell magic very differently. And that is how I've seen it spelled multiple times across multiple series. So I always felt like, oh, I love that spelling. And so to me, there is no difference between magic with a C or CK. It was just, I wanted to spell it differently so it feels like it's different and it connects to this other world out here, not our world.
Okay. Well, this next question I'm sure will be interesting to listeners at home. There are some very well done sex scenes in the book.
Oh, no. Yes.
And not being
my mom is not going to hear this one.
Oh, she's not? Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
For the next 10 minutes, tune out, Mom.
Right. Tune out, Mom.
Well, so not being a writer myself, I would imagine that a poorly executed sex scene could end up either boring, weird, or even comical.
Yeah.
So are there particular guidelines, for lack of a better word, to follow when writing these complex scenes? Or is it purely a creative flow that's impossible to explain? And can you expand on this particular element of writing? And one of the reasons I wanted to ask it is I had Ruth Ann Jaggi and Natasha Sinclair, who co-wrote a fantasy book, and Natasha does all the sex scenes because Ruth Ann says when she tries to write sex scenes, she just breaks out laughing. She's like, oh my God, this is the dumbest thing I've ever written.
Right. Oh, wow. Let me see. So for me, it is one of the hardest things to write. Because when you're writing those sexy, I call them smexy scenes. When you're writing those scenes, you're not just taking into account what the movements are, right? What the mechanics are, but you're also taking into account how someone is feeling. Where do the clothes land when they fall? Do they pick them back up? Was she wearing a tunic or a dress? Like, all of those things really matter in a scene. So I'll just be really honest. This is why having a great editor matters, because they can help coach you through some of these scenes. But one of the things that I struggled with is just getting right to it instead of a warm up, right? And so I've had to learn and really teach myself. I mean, there's workshops out there that teaches you how to like write these scenes in a way that resonates. And I didn't want the scenes to be overdone. And so that was the other thing. Like, I didn't want 2 chapters, 3 chapters of this. But when I finished my first draft and we did what I considered the final edits, I had a team of beta readers ready to read it. And so they also gave advice on, hey, we really want you to amp up the sex scenes a little bit more. So I went to work and I started writing. And it's so funny because my husband, he reads every book I write. And whenever he gets to like the sex scenes, he wants to read them out loud to me. I'm like so embarrassed. But we laugh and it becomes like this funny joke. But I really struggled with whether I was going to write sex scenes into the book or I was going to leave that, like we call it, off camera or off the page, right? But I felt like if I'm going to tell a true story about love and falling in love and loss and trauma and grief, I'm not going to hide the grief. I'm not going to hide the trauma. And I'm not going to hide how people fall in love and what they do when they ultimately feel like they're attracted to each other. So for me, it was important to do that. And then, of course, I had to tell my mom, oh, Mom, my books are going to have sex in it. And so she laughed and, you know, we've had a great time talking about it. But I'm really proud that I put that in my stories because I feel like it resonates well with people, which makes me feel good. Like, oh, I can write a sex scene now. So for the next book in Magic Rising, I went through the same kind of like struggle and I had to go back to Rise of a Dark Throne. Like, how did I say this? How did I do this? Where were they? Where did his arm go? I mean, the things you've got to think about that you don't normally have to think about when you're writing. But there was a lot of the technical pieces and still sounding natural and real.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to get your mom a special annotated version where all of the sex scenes, the pages are pink, and she'll just know to just scroll right through those.
Yeah, gotta do that. Gotta do that because, oh boy.
Well, there is a plot twist in the book that involves betrayal.
Yeah.
Once the ship docks in Sundom, we meet Rivian's brother, Prince Rill. Yes. Due to Sundom customs, where the second-born is considered less than the first, Rivian grew up in Rill's shadow. However, despite Rill's public presentation, he seemed to still love Rivian. So what exactly makes Prince Rill tick?
Nobody has ever asked me about him. I love this question. So the boys, I call them the boys, the brothers were raised by a tyrannical king. And so even when Rivian was in the sanctum, Rill found ways to write notes to his brother and get them to him because they weren't even allowed to communicate. It's supposed to be like a 7-cycle ban on communication, but Rill still found a way to get to his brother. And so it would have been really easy for Rill to become the monster that his father was, but he didn't. And he made promises to Rivian about what it means to lead and to be a king and to put your people before yourself. Even though Rill makes a lot of mistakes, I do think that Rill and Rivian ultimately have this beautiful relationship where they've really only been able to love each other in this family that they were raised in. And so that's why you'll see the strife in book 1. You'll see some reconciliation in book 1. There are characters in book 1 that I only gave people a glimpse of, but that they will show themselves later. So Rill is actually a main character in book 3. That's why I'm trying to be really careful on what I'm saying. But he becomes a main character. He takes center stage in book 3. And his story is a sad one too, because there are pieces of his story that I think people will be surprised to hear. So, you know, in book 1, a lot of people couldn't stand him. They were like, why didn't y'all? You could have killed him. I would have been fine. But I knew that I had this story in the back of my mind with Rill that was going to be really important for me to be able to share. And I thought I would share it in book 2, but it's in book 3 now. So that's Rill. Rill is proud. He's very factual. He also has to make really hard decisions. And sometimes it comes at the cost of others, but he really thinks like a king. And even when he makes mistakes, he's thinking like a king. And so it's tough. He has a tough road ahead of him, though.
Yeah, you painted him as this very regal character that carried himself well, like that charisma that just only certain people have.
In book 3, there's some things that happen between book 1 too, that in book 3, he shows up differently. And I paint that picture as well about, this is what loss can do to you, and it feels different, and you look different. And so I'm already so far from Rise of the Dark Throne in my mind that I'm like, okay, which parts did I share in there? Which parts didn't I share? Yeah. That's why all the books need to be launched already. So I can talk about it freely.
Yeah. Well, in your bio, it states that you have 2 master's degree in counseling and human services, which drives how you bring your characters to life. And this makes sense because the introspection of your characters is very complex. So how else does your experience in mental health influence the behavior of your characters?
Yeah, so I especially think it helps when I'm talking about the complexities of grief and loss. So, for example, Soul wakes up from the darkness and most of her people are wiped out, her Misa warriors. How do you respond to that? And so for me, it was important to show her hesitancy in leaving, or she bites her nails a lot. Like there's little pieces that I felt like, I want to make sure that people can see that she has this conflict within her. So for each character that I created, they have a personality type. They have personality. That was a lot of work. Personality type. They have a backstory. They all have experienced loss in some way, except for the people of Mose. It's almost like for a long time, the best thing they did was leave Sundom. The best thing they did was find their own way. And it's taken away what feels like instantly, right? We know it's generations later, but it feels that way. And, these are really young people too, experiencing these really big things. And so having lived all of us through a pandemic, I think that's where the darkness came from, right? I wanted to show what real grief and loss looks like. And then how do you move beyond that? In every story, I think Magic Rising is even heavier with the grief and loss, the complexities of the story. And so there's more ways that I feel like my degrees in counseling and human services and the work that I've been able to do, I've worked with people who, have experienced tremendous loss. And I often feel like I've stepped into that loss with them. So some of those painful moments, like there's real tragedy and loss, but you can also find yourself in that same space. You can also find love during that time. And so I think that's another unique piece to the story, is how people show up at the beginning and then where they're at the end is different. Even Soul in book 2 is a different person because you're just compiling her losses. And at some point that impacts who you are as a person. And so you'll see that in book 2, that she's a little bit more decisive. She's not fainting all the time. I think every time she was like overwhelmed, she was like fainting. She doesn't faint at all anymore. And I think that those are the things that really stand out to me. Like I wanted Luce and Zari to feel like my best friends from college, right? Those buddies that you went drinking with, right? And I think that we did that. But when you dig deeper, there's losses, there's grief, there's a lot of, the fact that Luce is a comedian tells us something about Luce too. And you'll see those things evolve and some of those cracks happen as the story progresses.
Well, the ending really pulls the rug out from underneath the reader. Did you have this ending planned before you started writing the story, or did you discover it as you wrote? And could you expand on your outlining process or maybe lack thereof?
No, that's all great questions. I'll start with, did I plan for a plot twist? I knew I would always write plot twists into my stories. I loved Game of Thrones. That whole first season was my favorite season because at the very last episode, the kid is thrown off the thing and you never saw that coming. And you're just kind of sitting there like in shock, and then it's over. Or the dad's head is like cut off and it's over. And you're like, wait, these are the main characters in the story. What are we doing? And I was compelled by those stories. But I also grew up, I'm Latina, so I grew up watching novelas on TV, novels on TV, and they were very dramatic and always had a plot twist. Actually, they always had 7 or 8 plot twists. So for me, that kind of connects me a little bit to my culture too, on how we write these stories, how we plan that the story's going to go. And then there's this shift. And so in my books, there's a plot twist every time. So, and I'm trying not to say too much. And I think that when the plot twist happens, because I've had one reader say, "Oh, I saw that coming." And I was like, "Okay, sure you did." And then she said to me, "So all the sisters are going to have magic, right?" And I was like, "I never said that." And she was like, "Wait, what are you doing to me? Like, I already have this story mapped out in my brain." But when I outline, it's weird because I don't know that I do it right. So I don't know. I break them up into acts, right? So first act, I want to introduce the world. I want to introduce the characters. And if it's the next book in a series, just give a little summary that doesn't feel like a summary about what we just experienced in book one, right? But then act two is really where you start to form these relationships, where the conflict starts to arise, where as you're forming these relationships, I tell people all the time, in my books, trust no one. Because I don't even know when I'm writing it, how it's going to end. Do not trust anyone. And I mean, I feel like I started with a plot twist, right? I have friends and relatives that have not finished reading Rise of a Dark Throne because they cannot get past chapter 2 because of what happens to Nasir and then how we end up moving on in the story. And I'm like, you've got to read the rest. There's so much more there. I do feel like plot twists make it interesting. And I think plot twists point to the complexities of being human. Everybody has something that's guiding them. Everybody has something that's driving them. And it may not always align with who I am as a person, who Rivian is as a person. Even you see the conflict between Rivian and Rill. They both want to do what's right, but getting there looks different. And so, yeah, for me, it was really important to have these plot twists. Like in book 2, there's a huge plot twist and it's someone everybody falls in love with. And you think, wait, what just happened? And then they have to reread and go back. And I want people to experience that with my books. I have people that have told me I will not read Rise of a Dark Throne because I've seen what people have said. I need to have the entire series before I can read it. And I say, don't do that. Indie authors really need you to read their books as they write them. But I'm excited to have so many plot twists in my mind. But I write out each act and then I write from that perspective. For Rise of a Dark Throne, I did plot out every scene and all of that. I don't do that anymore because it's all like here. And so as I start writing, I just keep it moving, keep it moving. So I think that's why Magic Rising became such a big monster of a book, because there was a lot of questions I wanted to answer. There was a lot of things that I wanted to tell, and I wanted to slow, because Rise of a Dark Throne really went fast, and I wanted it to go fast. Magic Rising is a little bit slower in that there's some questions I wanted to answer. And so I felt like it would be really important for people to experience that. So yeah, I do pull the rug out from people. And I'm sorry. It's emotional damage, I know. But I promise you, you will be happy with me in the end. I promise.
Well, who doesn't want that? Are there people that actually like, no, I don't want to be...
There's some people get mad. There's some people
good
get
God.
mad, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was an amazing book. Listeners at home, read it, buy it, review it. And I know you've been alluding to different elements or characters from this book and how they react, or possible character arcs in the next 2. So yes. I won't have you, really rehash anything. Can you just kind of give a brief description of what we can expect in book 2? And is your current work in progress book 3?
Yeah.
It's Magic Rising and then Rise of a Cursed Kingdom?
So my current work in progress is Rise of a Cursed Kingdom. Magic Rising is with the editor for the final look through, and then it's going to be live, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we hope. Oh. So Magic Rising stars Lola, Princess Lola. I can say this, she is Soul's sister. I won't say how or what happened or any of that. You've got to read the book. But I can tell you it'll be her journey, her love story, her conflict. And her journey really starts with this idea that she needs to get back to Mose. All this stuff has happened. She's been gone and she really needs to get back home. And she's fearless. And I'm not going to tell you why, because those are all the things that give it away. She is reckless and she is fearless. And that is a good and a bad combination. But I really wanted the second book's main character to be the opposite of Soul. but still have elements. So you can still see how they're sisters, the way that they talk, the way that they carry themselves. But she is definitely different from her sister. And my beta readers have adored her. They are like, yes, she is a femme fighter and we love it. So I'm excited about that story. Kingsley is the love interest in book 2. And he is the opposite of Rivian. He comes from Kingsguard Reef, which is an island right beside of Mosa. Their families were friends. They were friendly growing up. And so it's a different dynamic. He also hates Sundom. So it's this push and pull. But in this story, you really get to tour Sundom again. You get to go to places you haven't been before. And that's all I'm going to say. And you get to meet a whole new realm of people that are inspired by the Taino Indians in the Caribbean. And just like I did for the Mesa Warriors, I had to research who are these people going to be like. And so I learned so much about the Taino Indians. I have some ancestry in Taino. And so for me, it was really important to bring all the parts of me that make me into this story. And Rise of a Cursed Kingdom, I cannot say a lot about that. I can tell you that Rill is in it, and I can tell you that we are working on the cover art, but I cannot say anything else. I will like to give a shout out to my husband because he designs all of my book covers and they are beautiful. Wow. And he is brilliant and he pulls them all together. He does the layout. He does everything. So when I tell you it's a family business, it definitely is. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No, those are, does he do the graphics for the characters as well?
We do them together. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And he does we have character cards. This is such a whirlwind for me because I've never been to a book festival in my life and I'm an avid reader, but I went last year. So it was this wild experience. And so we saw character cards and stuff. And so my husband designed all these character cards for the conference we're going to in DC. We'll be at Imaginarium and we'll be having these there at the event. But it's such a cool experience to go and be with other authors and see what they're doing and how we're learning from each other. So it's a really cool experience. We're still very new. Even though I'm 3 books in, we're still very new to this world, for sure.
Well, you wrote a novella that I saw when I was looking around your bibliography, Shadows of Sundom, which you make very clear is not a love story, but a femme-rage coming-of-age story. So can you tell us exactly what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the story of Queen Ligia. And a lot of people think that I am a narcissist because I named the Queen of Mosa after myself. But it's actually, I named her after my mom. My mom's name is Ligia. And so Queen Ligia is very much like my mother. But it's the story of how she got to Mosa. That was one of the biggest questions that I had from Rise of a Dark Throne is, how did she even get there? What's her story? Where did she come from? And so I tell this story, how she was destined to be the next Queen of Sundom and the story that unfolds after that. So I was in a writing slump, honestly. I had just finished Magic Rising and I didn't want to start Rise of a Cursed Kingdom yet because I knew that was going to take some time to figure it all out and map it all out. So I was like, I'm just going to take a stab at a novella. Never written one before in my life. It was actually going to be a short story and then it ended up being more than that. So I was like, okay, whatever. But yeah, I love it because there's no romance. There's none of that. There's really this story of 2 sisters, just like the 3 sisters, 2 sisters who are really put in this really dangerous position and they have to figure out, how do we survive this? And so the sisters really fight their way through this Sundonian world. And so that's where, in that prequel, is where readers will get to see how violent Sundom is and why the people of Mosa made a decision years later, because it doesn't happen in this novella, but years later, why they made the decision to flee. And it makes sense. So I wanted it all to tie together. And that is free on my website. So people can read that one now before I take it down and make it a book.
Get in while the getting's good, people.
That's right. That's right.
Well, you also have a book entitled Herd, How Loss Led Us to Love, which, based on the description, seems like it's autobiographical. Could you tell us a little bit about this story?
Absolutely. So, wow, no one's ever asked me about this one unless I've been talking about our adoption story with our son. So Heard is a compilation of blog posts that I put together on our adoption story with our son and what it meant to be an interracial couple adopting a multiracial child in the Deep South and our experiences in that space. So Heard has been around for quite some time, probably since 2017, maybe. It was the first book I ever was like, oh, I want to write this. And on the cover is actually a picture of our son at the ocean. And so we named it Heard because his name is Jaden. And in Hebrew, Jaden means God has heard. And so we named the book Heard. And then I talk about the loss of miscarriaging. And again, you know me, you can tell now, I talk about loss, I talk about grief, and how that loss and that grief led us to our baby, who is now 18. He was a baby at the time. But so that's the other side of my life. I am a CEO for a national adoption organization. And so part of my story is connected to the impact adoption has had in our life. So that's what Hurt's about.
Okay. Well, what is, and I don't know, I'm possibly looking at it right now. What is your writing medium and atmosphere?
Ooh, this is it.
Am I in the sanctum right now? Well, no, not the sanctum in the sense of the book.
No.
But
Oh gosh, no, not in the sanctum for sure. Definitely not the sanctum. This is where I write. I'm either standing or I'm sitting, but I'm always in here writing. Honestly, I'm most active, or my brain is ready to write usually on Saturday mornings or Sunday mornings or late at night, like 10 o'clock. I'll walk over here and I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a chapter right now. I used to schedule time to write with the first book. With Magic Rising, I didn't. It just kept pouring out of me. And I just kept writing and writing and writing and writing. And with Rise of a Cursed Kingdom, it's more organized in that I finished Act 1. Normally, I'll just write the whole thing and then I'll go back and I'm like, okay, so what goes in Act 1? I'm not doing that anymore. I wrote Act 1. Act 1 is done. Now I'm writing Act 2. I'm halfway through Act 2 and then I'll get to Act 3. But it's a little bit more organized in the way that I'm writing. But I write in this space with a candle and coffee or wine. And that's my jam. And that's how I'm most comfortable. And people ask me you're a CEO and you're a mom and you're a wife and you write these books. How do you have time? But honestly, writing for me is very therapeutic.
So I hear cathartic a lot from authors. Therapeutic, better than exercise, would you say?
For my mind, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say so. I need to exercise more, I'm not going to lie. But yeah, definitely. It's first of all, I didn't even know this story was living in me. You know how people are like, oh, I've had this story in my mind for years. No, I took a master class online and to my husband, I went downstairs and I said, hey, I'm going to write a dark fantasy novel. And he was like, okay. And that was it. And I started writing. I didn't know anything about writing a novel that big, but I taught myself a lot. I have a lot of friends that are writers too, so they help me. But for me, I like quiet. I listen to the artist Sade when I write. That's the only artist I can listen to.
Interesting.
And it's been great for me. It's helpful, but I'm sure my husband is tired of hearing Sade. He knows when I'm writing because he hears her music all the time.
Well, if you're starting off, I could say an argument could be made you were doing the most difficult type of prose. Like fantasy is not only is it long, there's series, but I mean, just the worlds you create are so complex and the characters and everything. So you just went big.
I did. My husband, he looks at me like, are you not exhausted? I'll tell you, Heard was a great story to write. It was multiple little stories and it was great, but it wasn't fun. And I also saw that, especially during the pandemic where we were all really focused into social media, I kept looking at these books. And then on TikTok in particular, I love fantasy. All of these everywhere. They're all fantasy books. I love them. And I didn't see myself represented in them. And I kept thinking about my nieces and my nephews who also love it and don't see themselves in these stories that we love so much. And so I was like, I'm going to write one and see what happens. And I was most afraid to write world building. I didn't know that I could create a world. And that's the most accolades I've gotten from people is, oh my gosh, the bioluminescent bay, the people of Mosa, they're beautiful. People tell me all the time, like, I want to return to Mosa. Where's my next book? So it's been very rewarding. I will say that it's been very rewarding, and it's not easy. I will never tell anyone it's easy. I'm lucky that I am married to a marketing director who knows how to design beautiful things.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, I save money in that space as well. But when you're doing this on your own, there's a lot of expense that comes with it. I don't regret it, but I also know that as an indie, I have to really think through, where am I going to put the money? What makes the most sense? So I definitely poured into characters and art, and I really feel like because of our marketing strategies and TikTok, honestly, that's why I'm almost at 17,000 followers. I went there and found my reader audience. And I have almost 8,000 followers that are engaged, right? Because you could have all the kinds of followers you want, but people who are like, hey, tell me again what happened to Nasir, because I have a feeling, right? And so I love that I've been able to find people that connect with me.
And this is TikTok?
On TikTok, yeah. Instagram was a great kickoff starting point. And I met a book narrator who narrated Rise of a Dark Throne, Ruthie Bowles. And she said to me, girl, you've got to get on TikTok. I promise you, when you get on TikTok, you're not going to regret it. And it took me 3 months to do it. I was like, I just don't want another social media. But once I did it, I think maybe 8 posts in, I went like what I call viral. It had 400,000 likes and it just skyrocketed. And then people started buying the book and being interested and reviewing it and asking for a book club. And so I'm very thankful for social media. I think that's what makes being an indie author so much fun, is that you get to meet readers personally, like you get to connect with them on a different level. So it's been fun.
Yeah, I just recently got on TikTok. I got to make sure that I follow you on there. I don't know if you remember, the way I found you was I was friends with you on Instagram.
Right.
But the way I had a conversation with you was I just kind of stumbled into your live stream one night when you were editing your book. So actually, that was going to be one of my questions. Could you tell us about those live streams you do? I mean, you edit and write live?
Yeah.
Wow.
I just recently started doing it, by the way, because it can be a little distracting.
Isn't that like letting people watch you bathe almost?
Yeah.
Doesn't feel a little weird?
They can't see what I'm writing, but they can see that I'm writing, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes one of the things that I've started doing is, hey, I'm really stuck on this. Should he do this or should he do that? And they don't know who he is. They don't know any of that. But on TikTok, I've had up to 2,000 people just watching me write, which is like, it's interesting, but it's a really cool way to just give a behind the scenes look. You never really get to see the authors that you love writing. And so I've been able to do that. And at first I was like, this feels weird, but they like it. I like it. And I'm building a community. And so I think that's the big part. I'm also doing something, I'm going to try it once and see how it goes. But people have been asking me to do a book club, like author centered with some of my readers. And so for Magic Rising this summer, I'm going to kick off a book club where we can go through the book. People can ask me tough questions like you did today. And we can go through the book together and they can hear some tidbits from the author about like, well, why did you do this and not this? So I'm looking forward to it. People have been signing up, which is weird and exciting.
Awesome. Well, last question.
Okay.
Which book radically changed your view of what could be accomplished with the written word?
Okay, I have one.
Okay.
I just read this book last year. Kennedy Ryan is just, oh my God. She just writes books about grief and loss. Again, love stories about grief and loss. She just writes so brilliantly. You fall in love with the characters, her character development. When people tell me, oh, your characters are amazing, I'm like, have you read her characters? This book changed me because it was, I don't want to give away too much for people who haven't read it, but Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan actually was picked up recently by Hulu. They're going to have a series.
Okay.
Because this book was so great. But it's about a family who experiences a miscarriage, a really horrific miscarriage. And then what happens to the marriage after that. And the couple actually ends up getting divorced and living two separate lives, dating people. And then the mom starts to heal from her mental illness and the loss and the grief, and the dad does too. And they fall back in love.
Oh.
And this story is like, before I let go, how do we reconnect? And so for me, it was really healing, just because, with our own story of adoption and our own story of grief and loss, it was beautifully written and a beautiful way to see how pain can lead to something beautiful. And so, yeah, she's a brilliant writer. I just got her second book, This Could Be Us, but I haven't started reading it yet because it's one of those books that you're like, I just want to wait. I hold on to things for a while. I just want to wait till I'm like on the beach and I'm on vacation and I can just really take the book in. So Kennedy Ryan is definitely one of my favorite authors for sure.
Awesome.
And I found her on TikTok.
Another benefit. All right. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ligia, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun. Your questions were amazing. I love them. Very thought-provoking.
Well, thank you. It's very nice of you to say. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Yeah, I'm going to be at the Imaginarium Book Festival in June in DC. I believe it's June 7th and 8th. I'll be a guest author there, so I'll have Magick Rising with me. And so I'm really excited about that and be able to share it with readers. And yeah, I'm still plugging away at book 3, so we'll see. And Magick Rising, our tentative date right now is June 6th for it to launch. So we'll see if we make that deadline. I think we will, though. It's in a good place.
Awesome. Look forward to that. All right. Well, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Ligia, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday when I will be joined by one of the splatterpunk giants for his perspective on a unique story. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.